On the 1st of May 1648, an Ottoman force under the command of Ghazi Hussein Pasha arrived at the town of Candia, now called Heraklion, on the island of Crete. The Ottoman arrival marks the beginning of a war of attrition of epic proportion. It was to last for 21 long years. An entire generation struggled for much of their lifetime in this siege. Later, it was titled Troy's Rival by the famous English poet Lord Byron. It is considered to be the second longest siege in all recorded history. The siege of Candia was characterized by a struggle for supplies at sea, a war of attrition on land, and an unprecedented intensity of mine warfare. The siege was part of the Cretan War, in which Candia was the last major stronghold on the island to remain in the hands of the Venetian Republic. This is how contemporary historiography recounts the staggering siege of Candia. In the decades leading up to the Cretan War, the situation in the eastern Mediterranean was tense. The Venetian dominance in the region slowly waned after their loss of Cyprus in 1571. The island of Crete remained their last possession in the region. The Venetians were well aware of the weakness of their position in the eastern Mediterranean and carefully avoided provoking the Ottomans. However, in 1644, disaster struck as the Knights of Malta made a fatal mistake. They attacked and captured an Ottoman convoy on its way from Alexandria to Constantinople. Aboard these ships were several pilgrims, amongst them the exiled chief Black Eunuch and the nurse of the future Sultan Mehmed IV. During the attack, Sunbul Aga and many other pilgrims were slain, while 380 of them were abducted and sold into slavery. The ships of the Knights of Malta and their loot docked at a small harbor on the southern coast of Crete and allegedly disembarked some sailors and slaves. The Ottomans, obviously, were enraged and accused the Venetians of supporting the abductors, which the Venetians denied vehemently. However, the actions of the Knights offered a pretext for confrontation, and the Ottomans decided upon war. According to the expert on the relation between Europe and the Ottoman Empire, Kenneth M. Seton, the Ottomans quickly assembled more than 50,000 men. These embarked on a fleet of more than 300 ships and sailed west on the 30th of April 1645, heading for the harbor of Pylos, which was called Navarino at the time. The destination of the fleet had not been announced yet, because the Ottomans tried to soothe Venetian fears by implying that the fleet was bound for Malta, not for Crete. This deception worked out well. While the Venetians had sensed that something was looming over Crete and had prepared themselves to some degree, they were still taken by surprise when this large Ottoman fleet arrived on the island on the 23rd of June 1645. The island's fortifications were, in principle, substantial, but they were old and had been long neglected. The Ottomans appointed a Proveditore Generale di Candia, a commander only appointed in time of crisis, and bestowed him with supreme power over both civil and military officials on the island. He put a lot of effort into repairing the old fortifications. Venice had also sent 2,500 troops to reinforce the island in 1644. On Italian soil, the Venetians soon began to prepare their fleet for war and asked their allies for help. The Pope and the Duke of Tuscany promised their support. The Venetians on Crete were prepared for better or for worse. The Ottoman attack came in 1645. They first set foot on Cretan ground 15 miles west on the harbour city of Candia. From this base, they turned their attention to the small offshore island fortress of Sant'Odero. The commander of the fortress soon saw himself and his men overwhelmed. He decided it was better to blow up the fortress and his men than to hand it over to the Ottomans. After this first significant success for the Ottomans, their next target was Candia itself. The invaders advanced to the city and laid siege to it from both land and sea. The siege lasted 56 days before Candia finally surrendered. The Ottomans had now won a secure base on the island. Immediately, they began to rebuild the defenses, so that the Venetian attempt to recapture the town on the 1st of October was doomed, even though they were supported by the Papal States, Tuscany, Malta, and Naples. So now that you know a few things about the Siege of Candia, you should ask yourself, why have you not yet listened to Candia's Stance? One of the greatest siege stories the Warhammer 40k universe has to offer. I like science fiction just as much as history, and Justin Hill's novel Candia's Stance is a must for any fan of military history and sci-fi. There is no better place than Audible to listen to it, so thanks to Audible for sponsoring this video. What they offer is thousands of popular and binge-worthy audiobooks, podcasts, and more. What makes their app so great is that it actually remembers where you stopped your audiobook. You can also use it offline, and they even offer a sleep timer so you can fall asleep to some good old Warhammer 40k sci-fi read by the soothing voice of David Seddon. It is all easily accessible in one app. This is a service I wholeheartedly recommend. From stories to lectures on history, you get so much out of it. And it is free for the first 30 days. Visit audible.com/SandRhoman, link in the pinned comment and description, or text SandRhoman to 500 500 to get Audible right now, while also supporting our channel. Now that you know that Candia stands, let's jump back to the Siege of Candia. In November 1645, the Ottomans established a strong garrison and then retired to their winter quarters. During the winter, both parties frantically prepared for resuming the war next summer. Because the Venetians struggled to raise money and men, they tried to convince other Christian nations to join their side on the political stage. This was a difficult task, since much of Europe was still entangled in the quarrels of the 30 Years' War. According to Kenneth Seton, no help was to be expected even after the Treaty of Westphalia for several reasons. England and Holland, for example, had commercial agreements with the Ottoman Empire, and France was very keen to honor its treaties with the Eastern power. So the Venetians hired mercenaries to fill their rows, but these were incredibly expensive. To get the desperately needed funds, the Republic placed higher taxes on its mainland possessions and even opened the so-called Golden Book for money. This is to say, they sold nobility titles. The man to lead the Venetian fleet and army was Giovanni Capello, who was assigned Captain General of the Sea in 1646. He had a bad start, to say the least. He failed to prevent the arrival of Ottoman reinforcements, ordered an unsuccessful attack on the Ottoman fleet at the Bay of Canea, and failed to break the blockade of Retimo, which was one of the few remaining Venetian strongholds on the island. Retimo fell on the 13th of November 1646, after a siege of several weeks. Soon after, fighting ceased because the plague ravaged both sides until late spring 1647. In the summer of the same year, the Ottoman commander Ghazi Hussein Pasha carried out his conquest of the island, and by 1648 all of Crete except for Candia and a handful of other strongholds was in Ottoman hands. The invaders now turned their attention to the last major Venetian stronghold, Candia. The Ottomans began digging trenches at Candia on the 1st of May 1648. Their commander, Ghazi Hussein Pasha, ordered his sappers to invest the city completely. This took them about 3 months. At the same time, the Ottoman navy was cutting off Venetian supply lines. The fight for Candia was bloody and gruesome from the first minute. The Ottomans tested the defenders with several storm assaults and quickly installed a number of batteries and exploded more than 30 mines. The defenders, on the other hand, launched numerous sorties. As winter was approaching, the morale of the besieging soldiers ran low, and their mood turned mutinous. They refused to continue to fight in the trenches, and Ghazi Hussein had no choice for the moment but to lift the siege. The siege for Candia started slow, but rest assured, an Ottoman storm is coming. In the summer of 1649, the Ottomans renewed the siege. They retook their positions before Candia on the 1st of August, and this time they would stay longer. An enormous number of sappers was deployed and slowly but steadily drove the trenches towards the city walls. Within the next 2 months, another 70 mines exploded, and more than 1,000 Ottoman soldiers lost their lives. The Venetian defenders stood firm until another interruption occurred in early winter. 1,500 Janissaries, the Ottoman elite infantry, were withdrawn from the siege, and further reinforcements were not to be expected soon. Because his army now lacked the resources to engage in offensive actions, Hussein Pasha was restricted to blockading Candia. Soon after, the Ottomans began to construct 3 strongholds in the area. Throughout the next years, a town grew around one of them. It was named Candia Nova, New Candia. This new town symbolizes the Ottoman intention of staying where they were. Reinforcements arriving in 1650 allowed Hussein Pasha to keep Old Candia confined. According to the historian Norman David Mason, the years leading up to 1667 were, quote, more of a test of perseverance and tenacity rather than a trial of courage and cunning, end quote. Ottoman attacks alternated with Venetian sorties. The Candian defenders focused on reconditioning damaged defenses quickly, and they diverted the Ottomans by attacking several of their strongholds on the island. Neither side won much ground, but both sides were struggling to provide the immense resources such a fight required. It was a war of attrition. In this dire moment, the Venetians came up with a unique plan. Scholars recently discovered documents in the archives of the Venetian state, which hint at an operation organized by the Venetian intelligence service, the so-called Inquisitori di Stato di Venezia. In 1649-1650, Lunardo Foscolo, the Proveditore Generale di Dalmazia ed Albania, proposed to this intelligence service to lift the siege by infecting the Ottoman soldiers with the plague. Soon after, a certain Dr. Salomon invented and prepared a liquid made from the spleens and buboes of plague victims. The doctor and his dangerous invention were already on the way to Candia. Although the plan was organized flawlessly and ready to be implemented, it was never carried out. We do not know why, because the sources suddenly fall silent on this topic. What we do know is that Candia remained under firm blockade. While the Ottoman grip on Candia remained solid for the next years, the main theatre of war was the sea. It was strategically very demanding for both parties to wage war on Crete, because the island was far away from either side's home territories. Both belligerents had to supply their armies on the island, while at the same time they had to protect their own ships against enemy squadrons. Moreover, an Ottoman offensive on the Balkans forced the Venetians to divide their resources even further. Although the Senate of Venice concentrated as much of their resources on the naval war as possible, the Venetian fleet was smaller than the Ottomans' naval force. Venice only kept up with the Ottomans because their sailors were more experienced. The major Venetian strategy was to blockade the egress of the Dardanelles, while a small squadron held post around Candia and prevented a blockade from the sea. Although this worked out relatively well, the Venetians never blockaded the Dardanelles completely. Frequently, Ottoman squadrons made it through to Crete. From 1650 to 1665, numerous encounters at sea as well as attacks on harbors and islands took place. Some of them were major sea battles, for example at Naxos in 1651, at the Cyclades in 1655, or in the Dardanelles Strait in 1656. In general, the Venetians held the upper hand on sea, but they failed to transform their dominance into concrete results. From 1658 to 1666, the war at sea was at stalemate. The Venetians successfully attacked several Ottoman strongholds, but lacked the forces to occupy these places. Soon, they were also failing to maintain their blockade at sea. The Ottomans ordered the construction of 2 new forts at the European shore of the entrance of the Dardanelles: Sed el Bar, Rampart of the Sea, and Kilit Bar, Key of the Sea. This prevented the Venetians from entering the straits. However, at this time, the Ottomans were not only fighting the Venetians, but also heavily engaged with the Austrians in the Austro-Turkish War. Consequently, much of their manpower was needed on this front. After 1666, the naval theatre of war lost its importance. Only one major encounter at sea took place between 1667 and 1669. The focus of the war increasingly shifted towards the struggle for Candia. A major development in the war occurred when the Ottomans concluded their war against Habsburg Austria with the Peace of Vassar in 1664. As from now on, the Ottomans had much more manpower and resources for the war against Venice at their hands. The new Grand Vizier Ahmed Köprülü focused fully on this war. As the expert on siege warfare Christopher Duffy emphasizes, Ahmed Köprülü was not only determined to reduce Candia, but he also had the military experience required to fulfill that intention. Kenneth Sutton explains that the Grand Vizier began his preparations in the winter of 1665-1666 and dispatched some 9,000 men, along with ammunition and other siege equipment, to Crete. Ahmed Köprülü himself arrived in Candia on the 3rd of November 1666, from where he moved to the camps before Candia at once. While his men speedily prepared to rekindle the siege and increase the pressure on the town, additional troops and volunteers poured into Crete. By May 1667, about 70,000 Ottoman troops had gathered at the gates of Candia. Although this was partially balanced out by newly arriving Venetian mercenaries, historians estimate that the garrison of the defenders numbered no more than 11,000 men, of varying experience and training. On the 25th of May, the Grand Vizier held a council of war with his commanders to determine the dispositions for the siege. The Ottoman storm was coming for Candia in full force. During the first, relatively calm 15 years of the conflict, the defenders of Candia had been anything but idle. Some of the most skillful engineers of Europe had been brought to the city to improve its defenses, and they had made the town a tower of strength. While one side of the city faced the open sea, a ditch ran along the city on the three other sides. The walls themselves consisted of 7 strong bastions on the landward side and were reinforced by cavaliers, that is, raised platforms providing space for additional artillery. These bastions were connected by a curtain wall covered by outworks such as ravelins and several detached forts. The firepower of the defenders was increased by numerous artillery positions and caponiers running along the city walls. The garrison, the city's inhabitants, and the crews of the Venetian fleet had all helped to make the aging defenses of Candia a system of defense which was deemed nearly impenetrable. Ahmed Köprülü realized this on first sight. He abandoned any attempt to take the town by a frontal assault. Instead, he was determined to work his way forward in a regular siege. That is, to drive trenches up to the enemy walls. He chose this option because the low and thick walls of bastion forts were designed to resist artillery from afar while covering all angles of attack with their own cannons. On the 28th of May, the preparations were finished and an army of sappers took to work in the trenches. The Grand Vizier selected 3 bastions on the southwestern side of the city as main targets of the attack, namely Panigra, Bethlehem, and Martinengo. Because these points of attack were quite far away from the sea, the Venetian fleet could not provide fire support. Pioneers and sappers drove the trenches slowly towards the city walls. While the labyrinth of trenches and saps advanced ever further, a storm of shot and shell rained down on the city and caused immense casualties among both the defenders and the remaining inhabitants. It was not long until the Ottomans reached the slope of the glacis, which was intended to protect the walls from direct artillery fire. Now the Ottomans began to install their breaching batteries, which put them in a position to shoot directly at the walls. Their trenches and galleries, covered with earth and woodworks, soon reached the counterscarp, the side of the trench further away from the city. Meanwhile, the defenders of the town were harassing the attacking Ottomans not only by bombarding them continuously, but also by sallying out from their defenses and meeting the Ottomans with their swords in the trenches. They also continued to divert them by attacking places elsewhere on the island. Due to the superior numbers of the besieging Ottoman force, every attempt to end the siege was deemed to fail. In this dire moment, the Venetian Captain General Francesco Morosini entered the stage. Soon after the first Ottoman attacks in late May 1667, he arrived together with reinforcements of the Knights of Malta and the Papal States. Fun fact, Morosini always dressed in red from top to toe and never went into action without his cat beside him. Anyways, more of a threat than the Ottoman trenches and batteries above the ground were the mines, which were dug foot by men armed with shovels and daggers. Within a few weeks, a network of tunnels was dug around the city. While the Ottoman miners tried to undermine and explode the Venetian defenses, Venetian miners awaited them in countermines, ready to blow up approaches, seps and mines and bury the men working in them. The conditions in these dark holes were terrible, and suffocation was an omnipresent threat. The explosives varied from relatively small containers to dozens of barrels of gunpowder. Whenever possible, the miners intruded the mines of the enemy and exploded or sabotaged their explosives early. When enemy miners met each other, a bloody struggle ensued in the dark, muddy and narrow tunnels. The men, barely able to stand upright, fought each other eyeball to eyeball with daggers, clubs, and similar short weapons. As Christopher Duffy explains, mine warfare was actually a significant part of most of the sieges at the time, and extensively used by the Ottomans. As primary sources show, mines were exploding around the clock, causing at least as much terror as physical harm. From late May to early September alone, a total of 300 mines exploded in the Candian tunnel network. The ground around the town was riddled with craters from these explosions. The Ottomans made their fastest progress near the Panigra bastion. By October, they had breached the walls of this defense, and the Grand Vizier ordered a general assault on the weakened point. At first, this was very successful, and after a fierce struggle, Ottoman fighters stormed the bastion and mounted their standards on the walls. But the Venetians were well prepared and countered the attack by exploding 3 mines under their own bastion. The Ottoman soldiers were blown up, the walls crumbled, and everything was at a standstill for just a moment. Then the defenders stormed forward and pushed the attackers back over the walls. The Ottomans, who had been hurled inside the walls by the explosion, were decapitated and their heads thrown out as a gruesome message. The Venetians were quick to repair the ramparts of the bastion, but only a few weeks later, on the 11th of November, 4 Ottoman mines tore the walls apart for a second time. At this point, the Ottomans had taken the outworks of Bethlehem and Martinengo, but had failed to conquer a single bastion. As they now tested the defenders of Panigra again, they suffered massive losses but managed to lodge themselves in the ruins of the bastion. But Francesco Morosini had ordered his men to prepare for this. Working diligently, they had erected a new defensive line behind the Panigra bastion. This section of the defenses was completely cut off from the city by hard-wearing walls. In mid-November, the winter rains began. The trenches were regularly flooded. The same goes for mine tunnels. This forced Ahmet Köprülü to suspend operations. On top of that, the plague ravaged the Turkish lines, so that most of the Ottoman army had to retreat to the safety of Candia Nova. Despite the attackers being reduced to a skeleton army, the Venetians failed to push them back from the positions they had won in the summer. During the winter of 1667-1668, Ahmet Köprülü had his men raise additional batteries along the shore. From these positions, the Ottoman cannons severely hampered the vessels entering the harbor of Candia, but they never succeeded to fully block naval traffic. In addition, the Ottomans fortified a small anchorage nearby, which allowed their navy to sail much closer to Candia instead of having to land in Canea. To prevent this, Francesco Morosini ordered his ships to patrol the area. the 20 patrolling Venetian galleys were successful at first and defeated a fleet of Ottoman reinforcements from Rhodes. Soon after, however, they were defeated by a large Ottoman fleet in a sea battle near the islands of Ios. Following this battle, the Ottomans brought reinforcements and supply to the anchorage. The third Ottoman achievement of this winter was a cannon foundry established near Candia Nova. Because of the excessive firing and the exceptional duration of the siege, the guns of the besiegers were worn out and had to be recast. On top of that, new cannons, mortars and artillery of the caliber the Venetians used were produced so that the Ottoman gunners could reuse the balls fired from Candia. The Venetian defenders had been using the winter break as well. They had repaired the damage of the last year as far as possible, and additionally strengthened the eastern walls near the Sabionera bastion. There were signs of attrition, such as shortages of food and powder, but all in all, the situation was not too bad for the 5,000 to 6,000 remaining defenders. The Ottomans, on the other hand, were much fewer in 1668 than in the year before. The pressure on the city, however, was still immense, and according to an eyewitness, quote, "Every day there remained dead 50 or 60 Christians," end quote. Among mercenaries, Candia soon gained the reputation of a venture without return, and recruitment became increasingly difficult. However, Pope Clement IX was almost as eager to hold Candia as the Venetians themselves. Not only did he make enormous personal contributions, but he also undertook massive diplomatic efforts to organize help from other European states. He created an aura of crusade around the Cretan War. In 1668, his efforts yielded first results, probably because the 30 Years' War was over and the Spanish-French contest for northern Italy was in a relatively quiet phase. Venice was receiving more help in form of money and troops from other European states than ever before. It was not until June 1668 that the Ottomans revived the siege. This time, however, the bastions near the sea became their main targets, Sant'Andrea and Sabionera. At Sant'Andrea, they did not dig, but pile up the earth. The ground between the bastion and the Giofiro River consisted of bog-like marshes and solid rock, and the Turkish sappers had no choice but to bring immense amount of earth from elsewhere to build their approaches. They built a network of sandbags strengthened with gabions and fascines. From their already advanced positions, the attackers fought their way forward step by step. After weeks of struggle, they were threatening the whole western front of Candia. Morosini resolved to more drastic measures. He ordered his cavalry to sally forth and clear the trenches. The mounted men met firm resistance, but then, in a desperate fight, managed to push back the Ottomans from their most advanced positions. However, the besiegers continued their efforts at Sant'Andrea, and only the flanking fire of the bastions of San Spirito and Panigra stopped them. Simultaneous to the attack on Sant'Andrea, the Ottomans advanced towards Sabionera, where the ground was very sandy, as the name of the place suggests. Because of this, the miners of the attackers were much more efficient, and they had reached the walls of the bastion quickly. Shortly after, a mine under the walls opened a breach of 60 paces in the bastion's main wall. Disaster was avoided once more only by a newly constructed inner bulwark. For the Ottoman Grand Vizier, the sorties of the Venetian garrison soon proved to be the least of his problems. Sultan Mehmed IV was getting impatient and complained about the drawn-out siege and the enormous expenses in a letter. He urged Ahmed Köprülü to finish it at once. Much to the dismay of the Grand Vizier, the content of the letter of the Sultan leaked out to the troops, who were themselves worn out by the hardships of the protracted siege. Some of the troops mutinied, and soon after, the Ottoman soldiers rallied around the tent of the Grand Vizier and threw stones at him as he stepped out of his tent. His officers were just about able to push the men back and force them to return to their duty. Worst for the Grand Vizier, winter soon arrived, and the siege operations had to be suspended again. The Grand Vizier felt a lot of pressure now and made sure the trenches were guarded strictly, and the campaign of the next year was prepared carefully. He wrote to the Sultan, assuring him Candia was about to fall. The Ottoman Empire would not succumb to the Westerners after a contest of 20 years. The costs of the war, meanwhile, were absolutely staggering. Mason Norman Davies estimates Venice had invested 4,400,000 ducats and lost about 7,000 men, while the Ottoman casualties are estimated about 5 times higher. In spite of this, neither side was willing to give in. With little prospect of success, the Venetians sent Luigi Molini, an experienced diplomat, to Constantinople to discuss peace conditions. He offered to pay a tribute and compensations, but also to restore all the formerly Turkish lands in Dalmatia if the Ottomans abandoned the siege. However, the Sultan and his Grand Vizier made it very clear that there would be no negotiations as long as Venice didn't cede the complete island of Crete to the Ottomans. In early 1669, negotiations were suddenly suspended. This was mainly because of the influence of the Pope, who wasn't willing to accept a defeat in a war he had given the aura of a crusade, and because of a change on the diplomatic stage in mainland Europe. Under the influence of Pope Clement, France and Spain finally agreed to abstain from waging war on each other for the duration of the Cretan War. This was beneficial to the Venetian efforts in Candia, because both these European powers had promised support only if there was peace in Western Europe. This was a major triumph in the Pope's diplomatic quest to unite the strength of Christendom. During the winter months, the Ottomans just kept up the blockade of Candia, but once the reinvigorating sun of spring began to warm Cretan soil, they returned to their shovels. On the 31st of March, the Janissaries launched a storm assault on the Sabbionera bastion and successfully overran it. But as soon as they had lodged themselves in, the Venetians again blew up a mine under their own bastion. In the ensuing confusion, they took the bastion back. Only 1 week later, on the 7th of April, another mine exploded under Sabbionera, this time carefully prepared by the attackers. It was extremely effective, and a large part of the bastion fell into the ditch. At this point though, the low morale of the besiegers became a problem for Ahmed Köprülü. He ordered his men to storm the breach, but they refused to take the risk of another assault, and confined themselves to a massive hail of fire on anything that moved on or near the walls. In the meantime, the Venetians had dug a mine tunnel under the plate of rock on which the Ottomans constructed their approaches. In arduous efforts, they placed a mine of exceptional dimensions and carefully sealed it. The explosion allegedly shook the ground for miles around and shattered the solid rock into fragments, so that the ground engulfed the helpless attackers and their trenches. This was another severe blow to the morale of the Ottomans, and their commanders barely managed to keep their troops fighting. Subterranean encounters took place daily now, and both parties fiercely fought for the domination of this gigantic rabbit warren underneath the trenches and defenses. In June 1669, an allied army of Papal, Maltese and French vessels set sail for Candia. This was one of the largest fleets ever assembled to support the town. The King of France had armed 6,000 men and sent them to Candia. On the 19th of June, almost 2 weeks before the heavy warships arrived, some of the lighter ships already made it to Candia. Aboard were mainly French soldiers who entered the city under the cover of night. Only the musketeers of the king refused such a cowardly entrance and disembarked the next day in plain sight of the enemy. The result of their chivalric landing were several dead musketeers. With this addition to the garrison, the Candian forces were stronger than ever. The arrival of these reinforcements didn't lessen the Ottoman soldiers' dismay, but at the same time Sultan Mehmed IV gave a blank check to proceed with the siege to the Grand Vizier. After a short and decisive council of war, the Ottomans reinvigorated their efforts to take Candia. Meanwhile, the French in Candia grew increasingly impatient. Their commander, Philip II, Duke of Navai, insisted on immediate action. In the early morning of the 25th of June, the French assembled along the eastern defences of Saint-Demetri and stormed forward in a hasty sortie, without being adequately familiar with the terrain or the enemy. They successfully carried several batteries and cleared a good deal of the trenches in this area, but then an Ottoman powder magazine caught fire and exploded amidst the forward-pushing French. Panic spread quickly among them, so that they turned around and fled back to the town, leaving about 1,200 dead and wounded on the fields and in the hands of the Ottomans. The rich booty taken from the bodies of the French noblemen and the head money the Grand Vizier set out made the Ottoman camp a thriving market for precious goods for some time. On the 3rd of July, the sails of the Allied Armada finally appeared on the horizon. A joint assault by land and by sea was launched near the Sant'Andrea bastion. On the morning of the 24th of July, the galleys began to bombard the Ottoman batteries. But after 3 hours of fighting, the French flagship exploded as its powder magazine was hit by a cannonball. This spread massive confusion in the attacking fleet and disrupted the whole enterprise, which ended in a disaster. Simultaneously, the land attack failed too, due to the resistance of the Janissaries and a lack of coordination between the Allied troops. This was a welcome relief for the Ottomans, who immediately returned to their approaches and who were striving for retaliation. Francesco Morosini's cautious proceeding was mistaken for cowardice by the French, who consequently refused to take part in the construction of new defenses. The Duke of Navai declared he had been tricked into thinking the town was defendable by the Venetians, while it was, in fact, untenable. The blood between the allies turned bad. During the next weeks, the Allied commanders discussed over and over again what they should do, while the mood got worse and worse. They came to no clear decision, while the Ottoman assault branded against the city walls in short intervals. Finally, on the 20th of August, the Duke of Navai left the city with all but 500 of the French soldiers. This was a severe blow to the morale of the garrison, and most troops soon followed the French example. Only the Germans agreed to remain on their posts. On the 31st of August 1669, the last of the Allied squadrons set sail and left Candia to its fate. Francesco Morosini and his men, by now less than 4,000, remained to defend the town. The Ottomans were pushing hard from all sides. The defenses were badly damaged and the men were burnt out. The situation was hopeless. On the 6th of September, Morosini had no choice but to hoist the white flag. After long deliberation, Candia was surrendered on condition that the garrison and all inhabitants were allowed to depart with all military honors, their property and their artillery. The Venetians were to retain their conquests in Dalmatia, Bosnia and Albania. Despite these highly favorable terms for Venice, Morosini was criticized harshly in the aftermath, because he had surrendered Candia and negotiated peace without receiving permission from the Venetian Senate. On the 27th of September, the Grand Vizier made a triumphal entry into the town, and the last man of the garrison embarked for Venice. At last, Venice ceded Crete to the Ottomans. This put an end to one of the longest and bloodiest sieges in history. It became a lesson for a new generation of engineers. Candia seemed like a pile of stone with only the innermost parts of the city fairly intact when the Grand Vizier entered the town. The garrison had made nearly 100 sorties and faced about 60 direct assaults on their walls. More than 1,100 Venetian mines exploded, while the Ottomans counted 3 times as many. The Venetians alone had used more than 48,000 shells and over 100,000 grenades. During the 21 years of the siege, about 120,000 Ottomans and 30,000 Venetians lost their lives, not to mention civilian casualties. For about one generation, Venice and the Ottoman Empire struggled for Candia, and many spent the best part of their lives at, on, or underneath its walls. If you like the way we present history, please consider donating via Patreon or PayPal. These videos take a lot of time and effort to create, and a small tip goes a long way helping us run the channel.